Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a truly monumental period in American history. We're talking about the massive societal shock of the industrial boom. It's this incredible story of what happens when the unprecedented, explosive rise of the industrial city literally collides with ancient religious institutions. As we'll see, this collision permanently fractured and ultimately evolved the American church as it desperately struggled to adapt to a world that was suddenly completely unrecognizable.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to break this down into 6 parts. First, the industrial-urban shock. Second, the Great Divide. Third, flight, fight, or accommodate. Fourth, new urban strategies. Fifth, the theological shift. And finally, number 6, the battle for authority.
All right, let's jump right into Chapter 1, the Industrial Urban Shock, a New Reality.
You know, it's so easy for us to take modern labor laws for granted today, but to really grasp the dilemma the church was facing, we have to look at the absolute brutal reality of this era. I mean, prior to 1835, your average industrial laborer was standing at a loom or hunched over a sewing machine for 14 to 16 hours a day, and that's often 7 days a week. They're doing this in these cramped sweatshops, no AC in the sweltering summer, barely any heat in the freezing winter, and the pay? Roughly $1 a day. Just let that sink in. It's exactly why entire families, we're talking fathers, mothers, and young kids, all had to work in these factories literally just to scrape by and survive.
And because of this, an absolutely stark wealth gap emerged. Just think about the extreme contrast here. On one side, you've got the sheer misery and overcrowding of places like the Lower East Side of New York, which, by the way, was the most densely populated place in the entire world at the time. Then, completely on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Newport mansions. These were massive, incredibly opulent estates. But here's the kicker. They were basically just summer homes. The extremely wealthy only used these giant houses and the massive staffs required to run them for maybe 8 weeks out of the year, just to escape the city heat.
Moving on to Chapter 2, The Great Divide, a tale of two demographics.
So as the cities exploded, we historically see a tale of two very different demographics. For a huge number of Protestants, they started finding their historic churches utterly irrelevant to their new, grueling industrial struggles. Many just started ignoring the church entirely, or even worse, they grew actively hostile toward it. But conversely, Roman Catholic and other immigrant populations, like the Lutherans, they stayed deeply connected to their local parishes. You have to remember, in an incredibly harsh, sometimes really hostile urban environment, these immigrant churches served as a crucial family refuge. They were like a safe haven.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, Flight, Fight, or Accommodate.
Okay, let's walk through the 3 initial reactions the Protestant churches had to this whole urban crisis. Reaction number 1, the suburban exodus. Basically, any church with enough resources just packed up and fled the city as soon as they could. But by doing that, they became totally removed, both geographically and morally, from the very real problems of the crowded inner city. Then, reaction number 2, inner city isolation. These were the churches that simply couldn't afford to leave. But instead of ministering to their neighborhood, they kind of just circled the wagons. They were barely surviving, meeting down in church basements, completely isolated from the chaotic world right outside their doors. And finally, number 3, wealthy accommodation. Some churches did stay in the city, and they built these magnificent, soaring structures. They appealed directly to the wealthy elites using highly charismatic preachers. The catch? To keep those powerful members happy, they often watered down their message, totally avoiding any difficult or controversial topics just to maintain that financial support.
Next up is Chapter 4, New Urban Strategies, Breaking the Mold.
So obviously, traditional methods just weren't cutting it anymore, right? Realizing this, several groups started to really innovate. Take the American Sunday School Union, founded way back in 1824. They went directly to the people, heavily focusing on literacy to produce a highly educated laity. Then you had the YMCA, which took a holistic approach to ministering to young urban men. They addressed physical, social, educational, and spiritual needs all at once. And the Salvation Army? They literally moved directly into the slums. They lived right there in the tenements, set up daycare centers, and proved that physical care, doing something as basic as providing fresh water, was absolutely essential if you wanted to reach the spiritual person. Finally, we see non-denominational revivalism. They basically brought rural camp meetings straight into the heart of the city, cleverly adjusting their meeting times to noon and late evening shifts to actually accommodate the grueling schedules of exhausted factory workers.
Now this begs a really fascinating question. Why was this revivalism so wildly successful? Preachers like Charles Finney and Dwight L. Moody, they went into these huge cities with genuine trepidation. They were honestly wondering if urbanites would even bother to show up.
Yet, they ended up drawing absolutely massive crowds. So why was that?
Well, the answer really lies in three brilliant cultural reasons. First off, it cured urban anonymity. It gave these incredibly lonely factory workers a genuine sense of community. Second, it broke up that deadening 14-hour daily monotony with a much-needed burst of energy and excitement. And third, which is actually kind of ironic, it provided a substitute for the live theater. You see, at a time when many folks viewed the theater as this godless, sinful place, Revival stepped in and offered amazing music, singing, and some really great oratory. They essentially replaced the theater by providing culturally acceptable entertainment. All right, moving into Chapter 5, the theological shift, re-understanding the gospel.
This brings us to a massive pivot point: classical Protestant liberalism. Now, historically, Protestantism's absolute authority was always strict biblical scripture. But suddenly, they are facing the rise of Darwinism, brand new sciences, and these overwhelming social changes in the cities. So this movement emerges. It was a direct attempt to develop a totally new theology that could somehow reconcile historic faith with these undeniable new intellectual and scientific realities.
And you can think of this theology as operating kind of like a two-sided coin. On one side, it demanded freedom from tradition. This meant shedding what they saw as oppressive church traditions and overly strict historical interpretations. But on the flip side of that coin, it required an adjustment to the modern world. They had to actively adapt their message so it would actually appeal intellectually to modern minds living in this new industrialized society. You really can't fully grasp this massive shift without looking at both sides of that coin at the exact same time.
And that leads us to our final section, Chapter 6, The Battle for Authority, the 20th Century Stage.
As many of you probably know, this theological shift didn't just quietly stay tucked away in academic textbooks. No, it rapidly moved into absolute cultural dominance. Right before World War I, classical Protestant liberalism systematically infiltrated the leading Protestant seminaries, the very places where the entire next generation of ministers was being trained. Those graduates then went out and filled the major city pulpits, preaching this newly adapted message to massive influential congregations. It also completely dominated influential publications. In fact, one major religious journal launched right at the turn of the century was so incredibly confident in this new progressive worldview, they boldly named themselves the Christian Century. They literally thought they owned the next 100 years.
But, as we all know, history is rarely that simple. Even as liberalism confidently declared the dawn of a progressive Christian century, an absolute firestorm of a pushback was already brewing. So the question is, how would the impending rise of American fundamentalism and later on neo-orthodoxy violently push back against this modern theology? Well, that inevitable, monumental battle for ultimate authority is exactly what would go on to define the entire rest of the 20th century. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep digging into the history, and I'll see you next time.